now we take you to London, England, where acclaimed British intellectual Noreena Hertz is standing by for her live radio broadcast. MegaHertz, London Calling. Opinions and conversations from a British point of view about Europe, America, and everything British.
This is not your father's BBC. No stiff upper lip, no keep calm and carry on, no tea and crumpets or tally-ho. It's opinions and fresh perspectives, from politics to pop culture and everything in between. It's honest, fun, raw, and unfiltered. Live from London, this is MegaHertz London Calling with your host, Noreena Hertz.
This is Noreena Hertz, welcoming you to a special edition of MegaHertz, the show that crosses oceans, cities and plains to bring you the best and brightest voices bearing news and views from Britain and Europe. Back in 1980, Jimmy Carter signed a presidential decree designating this week National Women's History Week. As he said, the achievements, leadership, courage, strength and love of the women who built America was as vital as that of the men whose names we know so well. Hear, hear. Thursday is, of course, also International Women's Day, and here at MegaHertz we love to lead the way. So today I'm joined by three boundary-breaking British women, performers, reformers, writers and thinkers, whose work puts them at the front and centre of their respective fields. Shazia Mirza is best known for her satirical wit. She's Britain's most famous female Muslim comedian, and by now a global star. Haven't you just come back from Los Angeles, Shazia?
Yes, that's right. I wasn't in any Hollywood films or anything like that.
But you are also an actress and an award-winning columnist. Shazia, welcome. Also joining us today is Rebecca Stott, a novelist whose work the New York Times has compared to Edgar Allan Poe and who has just won Britain's most coveted prize for a biography, the Costa Award, for In the Days of Rain, in which she tells the story of her astonishing childhood, growing up and escaping from an extremist Christian cult, the Exclusive Brethren. Rebecca, welcome. And we are also joined, and I'm delighted to say, by the economist, writer and campaigner Vicky Pryce, a woman I've been friends with now for over 20 years, who was actually one of my first bosses way back. After a glittering career in the corporate world, Vicky headed the UK government's economic service, the first woman to do so. She went on to do more in economics and in business, but 5 years ago she was sent to prison for agreeing to take her then-husband's speeding penalty as her own. She emerged as a campaigner for the rights of women in prison. Welcome, Vicky. I'm so glad you could join.
Thank you.
In fact, welcome all. So this is my first all-female lineup at MegaHertz, and I like it. It has a nice vibe. And given that it's National Women's History Month this month in the United States, because in 1987 Congress extended President Carter's Women's Week to a whole month, I wanted to just start by asking each of you briefly which women in history inspires you? Rebecca.
I'm working on a big project on Rome and London at the moment, so my head is full of all things antiquarian. So the very first woman who came to mind was Boudica, once known as Boadicea in the old days. Boudica, who was a tribal leader whose land was taken from her by the Romans and whose two daughters were raped. She was flogged in front of her people and she had enough. And so she pulled all of her tribes together and she marched on Colchester and then on Londinium, taking her tribes with her, and did some terrible damage. So in London, you can actually see now in the strata underneath London a line of oxidized iron, red line where she razed the city to the ground. I mean, she lost and she knew she would, but my goodness. And there's this wonderful story about how when she lined her troops up in front of the Roman troops, and there they were with all of their metal and armour and everything, and she released a hare into their ranks. And for me, that's just such a beautiful and poetic image, because that hare was not what they were expecting. And it sent their ranks, their neat, tidy little ranks, into disarray. And so for a little while she had the upper hand. So that unpredictable, wild thing released into the Roman army for me.
And something
Boudica's
so
hair.
small creating so much havoc.
Yes.
Yes, I like that.
And being prepared to take them on.
I like that. Shazia.
I have chosen Asma Jahangir. She's not that ancient. She only died last week. And she was a woman in Pakistan, a lawyer, who had set up a law firm by herself and her two sisters, where she fought for women's rights and women who couldn't afford to get any help when fighting their cases, which were mainly about domestic violence, forced marriage, stuff like that. And she set up this amazing law firm for free, where these women could come and get all their advice and all help for free, because in Pakistan they don't really have much respect for the law, and there hasn't really been a law. I mean, it's been very flimsy for many years. And she did this all by herself, and people were scared of her. People really respected her, and she really helped a lot of women. It was mainly women, and it was mainly abused children that she helped. And there was no place like that, and there was nobody doing that in Pakistan at the time. And even now, there's not many women that single-handedly help other women and abuse children for free, for no money, against a state which is really quite corrupt. And she died last week, and the whole country was in mourning, men and women. And it's strange because the world really hasn't known about her or known about her work, because like many women in Pakistan, you know, they just get on with it and they just do it, and they don't get much recognition in their own country. So in the wider world, they don't get recognition. And it wasn't till she died last week till many women came out and said, you know, she helped me escape my abusive husband. She saved my life. She saved my children's life.
What an incredible woman. Well, thank you for bring her to our attention and to the wider listeners' public attention. Vicky.
As you know, I'm Greek, or rather, perhaps the listeners don't know that, but Noreena knows this very well. And the person I have chosen is a Greek lady who is called Laskarina Bouboulina. Well, she was born quite some time ago, I'm afraid, by comparison to the one we just heard about in 1771. But in 1821, when the Greeks were beginning to revolt against the Ottoman Empire, which of course had occupied Greece for 400 years exactly, she was very instrumental in leading a fleet that did all sorts of interesting things, including a naval embargo against the Turks, and managed to then capture various bits of Greece that were all being gradually put together. Well, she was married. I have to say that the way that she did it is she sort of inherited, if you like, quite a lot of wealth. She came from an island called Hydra, which is a very famous island, actually, in Greece. And she inherited her second husband's fortune. He was quite a rich trader. He had quite a lot of ships, and he died, unfortunately, when she was about 40 in some fight against some Algerian pirates. So she inherited all that,
And she used that money.
She used all that money to build more ships, in fact, and then to finance, if you like, the people who sailed on them, the fighters, the ammunition, the food, everything you could possibly imagine. She did, and it was an extraordinary development, because she was really the only woman. She became actually something like a vice admiral for the Russian Navy as well.
Amazing. So amazing. What another amazing woman. So you all picked very unconventional women who fought for what they believed in, women who faced adversity and triumphed, which gives a sense of the mettle of my guests. So I think we're looking forward to a very good show. Now, Rebecca Stott was the fourth generation of her family to be born into the Exclusive Brethren, a fundamentalist Christian cult. She was raised in a world which the Brethren believed was ruled by Satan. Music, books, television, radio, newspapers, theatre and films were all banned. She went to school but was not allowed to participate in most of the lessons. She was not allowed close friendships with people outside the cult. Women wore headscarves and were only permitted to raise families and do what men told them. By the age of 7, Rebecca had been subjected to thousands of hours of meetings at which men spoke about scripture, but women and girls could only listen, and all of this happened in the middle of an ordinary seaside town here in the United Kingdom. When the cult collapsed, after its charismatic leader was caught in adultery, often these guys are caught in adultery, and Rebecca's father led the family out into a world they barely understood. Rebecca is now a professor of literature and creative writing, an acclaimed novelist and historian, and the author of a memoir of her time in and after the cult in the Days of Rain, which has won Britain's most prestigious prize for biography. Rebecca, can you give me a sense of what it's like to grow up in a cult? What were your days like?
Very ordinary. Very ordinary insofar as we had no point of comparison. I think it was when I first went to school that I realised that other people didn't live like we did. We had meals and we had play and so on. Had a very large number of siblings. But our days were organised around the meeting. So we had a meeting every day, and then 4 times on the Lord's Day, as we called it. So every part of our day was structured around preparing for going to meeting, coming back from going to meeting, going to other people's houses in between meeting.
And what happens in meeting?
In meeting, everyone sits in a circle, the men in the middle with the microphones, the women at the outside with no microphones and with the children. And the men, there's no ritual as such, but the men debate biblical, scriptural, the meaning of various scriptures. All sorts of things happen, but that's mainly it. And of course, we didn't have television or radio or newspapers, so we spent a lot of time together. We didn't have any books. We didn't have children's books. So our play was very much sort of conditioned by the very small world in which we lived. I don't think it was an unhappy childhood, but I know that it was remarkable going to school because suddenly there was a glimpse of other children who were like aliens. They talked about ordinary things that were ordinary to them, like Crackerjack and the school, and
a popular children's
television
show at the time,
and books that they were reading. And we couldn't, even if we wanted to have conversations with them, it wasn't possible. We spoke this kind of rather cute or rather quaint Brethrenese. There was no way of. We had no common culture, if you see what I mean.
So, were you able to make friends with any of the ordinary children, or did you?
No, because we were told it was just taken for granted that everyone outside our closed community belonged to Satan and that they were lost, and that when push came to shove, and push would come to shove, i.e. the rapture was coming, and we would go, or my parents would go, all the good people around us would go in the rapture, in the second coming, as it were, and that everyone else was going to face the most appalling oblivion, terrible things, plague, famine, earthquakes, and they didn't know it, so that was a very extraordinary thing, secret to have, that when I was at school, I knew when I was playing in the playground that all these people were going to go. But of course, I also believed that I would have to remain and face those things too, because I wasn't good enough to go in the rapture.
So did you, because you felt even as a child that you were sinning?
Yes. I just took it for granted that there was no way that I was good enough. I didn't really know how to be good enough, if you know what I mean. Like it was very opaque, like how one would be good enough to go, how one would be pure enough. So this is a cult that's obsessed with spiritual purity, so cleanliness, having a clean home, having a clean heart, all of those things. And that was one of the things that I was it sounds really grim, but for me it was just practical, that at some point, next week, next month, next year, my parents and everyone I knew and trusted would disappear in the middle of the night. And I also took it for granted that I wouldn't go, and nor would my brothers, because I knew that they weren't going to be good enough either. So we would have to figure out a way of getting by and staying away from the bad people outside. So I had all sorts of plans about going to my grandparents' garage. I knew where the key was. I'd figured out how to use tin openers. I started hoarding tins under my bed. These were kind of
So like
slightly
survivalist.
cheerful, quite practical survivalist fantasies. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out some of the theological puzzles in the Bible, because that was the other thing I did. I listened very, very hard to some of the things that the men were talking about. And I could see contradictions everywhere because...
Even as a child?
Even as a child, yeah. I mean, I really spent a lot of time listening hard. But the trouble was you couldn't ask questions about those things because then you'd get into trouble.
So did you rebel in any way as a child?
I felt very angry a lot of the time. And I remember, I think the most dominant feeling I had, other than this, we've got to survive, we've got to find our way to do this and that when the bad things happen, I felt very angry that God didn't speak through the mouths of women, because I knew that the women who sat on either side of me, my mother, my grandmother, my aunts, were all deeply spiritual, deeply good, deeply wise people. But we were told that the Holy Spirit would never speak through their mouths because the Holy Spirit didn't do that. And so women were supposed to have no opinions. They were supposed to obey their husbands. And I could see the most terrible abuses happening to those women, being shouted at, being told they were liars, really, really bad things. And I knew that all of that was wrong. So I had no way of making sense of that, because if you're in a cult and you're a child in a cult, you've got no one to go to check that reality with, if you see what I mean.
And you didn't feel you could go to a teacher at school?
No. I mean, that would have just been... I don't think they'd have understood anyway. How do you explain any of that as a small child? I've got the language now. Yes. It's taken me until I was at my early 50s to write about this, but I didn't have the language then.
And cults have a history of treating women members particularly badly, don't they?
Yeah, most cult leaders are men.
Yes.
And most cult leaders involve quite a lot of subjection of women. Most cult systems involve that to some extent. It's about power in the end. One of the things I came to realise in doing lots of reading about it, because ultimately what you're reading about when you read about cults is about totalitarian systems. And what I came to understand is that a totalitarian system, like a controlling system, can be as big as Mao's China and as small as a one-on-one abusive relationship. They work in almost identical ways. They isolate the victims from the rest of the world. They brainwash, they control, they keep people under surveillance. So that's the astonishing thing, is that actually there's something very simple at the heart of all of this.
Power and dominance.
Power and dominance, yeah.
Your parents decided to leave.
Yeah.
Why?
There was a big scandal back in 1970 when the cult leader was found, as you said, in bed with a much younger woman who was married. He claimed that God had told him to set this thing up.
I'm sure he did.
Because then the impure people would all get on their high horse and leave. And that would be a marker of who the bad people were, the impure people, and they would go. So my grandfather and my father and many of the people around us, but not all of them, said, this is beyond the pale. We are not tolerating this. And they left. But there were a number of relatives who stayed in, and the cult, such as it is, the Exclusive Brethren, is now as big as it ever was.
Yes,
so,
I did some research and I went on their website.
Yes,
I mean, they've got a very glossy website.
Yeah,
in
with
fact.
lots of pictures of families having a lovely time.
Yes. Be warned, listener, if you end up on their website. What was leaving like?
Lots of people talk about when you leave a cult, or lots of people assume that when you leave a cult, it's going to be like wonderful, because suddenly you've got all these things that you never had before: television, radio, newspapers, cinema. And we did have all of those things. But I think one of the things that I remember was confusion. A great deal of the structure of our lives, the daily structure of our lives, not just the things that we did, but the things that we believed in, the rules, the infrastructure, if you like, had all disappeared. And now, in a way, everything went. So within 2 years of us leaving, my father brought a television into the home. And I remember being really shocked by that, like what is happening to my parents? Because they were so confused that they didn't think to sit down with us and say, we said that Satan owns all these people out there, runs everything out there. Well, actually, we were wrong. We said that Satan controls television sets and radios and newspapers. Actually, we were wrong. They didn't do that because maybe they thought we were too young to really take it all in. But it was profoundly confusing, and it was for my father as well.
Yes.
And the book is as much about my father and his unravelling, if you like, after we left the cult.
After, we're now many years after you left the cult. But you write that after you've said in my research, I saw that after you wrote the book, you were terrified and you were kind of plagued with anxiety. Why? Yeah, it was a real shock, actually. It was about this time last year, and I had handed the book over to my publishers, and the process had begun, towards publication. And I suddenly found myself extremely anxious in a way that I'd never really experienced before in my life. And I understand now that what I was experiencing was what sort of cult psychologists call existential dread. The sky's going to fall, something bad's going to happen, I'm going to be struck by lightning. I was afraid of brethren retribution, which is a very real fear. They are very litigious, they're very aggressive, and I was afraid a bit like
of
Scientologists.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a lot of money and they're very, very powerful. And I was afraid in more general ways, really, of having what my mother would call spilling the beans. It was a big thing in the Brethren about keeping quiet, not talking to the people out there, not giving your people away. And it felt as if I had spilled the beans and that there was going to be bad stuff happening as a result. I mean, actually, it's been incredibly moving because I've had hundreds of letters from ex-brethren, many of them very elderly, who have, as it were, all of them use the same metaphors. They say, I've not been able to face it. I've drawn a line over all of that. I've not looked back. I can't look back. And that what reading the book had enabled them to do was to talk to their grandchildren and their children about what it was like to live through that for the first time. So it had been painful, but it had also released things. So I've just ended up feeling part of a big tribe of people again,
Well, I mean, I found the book really moving and inspiring and a beautiful read. I strongly recommend it. Thank you so much for coming on. Rebecca's memoir, In the Days of Rain, is out now in paperback in the United States, United Kingdom and all over the world. Rebecca's story of breaking out is extraordinary. The amazing tale of my next guest is all about breaking in. Shazia Mirza is a woman who came to public attention as Britain's first female Muslim stand-up comedian, and she didn't sidle quietly into the spotlights. Post 9/11, when the Muslim community was as traumatised as everyone else and scared of a backlash, Shazia announced herself to the world with a phrase typical of her fearlessness. "My name is Shazia Mirza, or that's what it says on my pilot's licence." America took notice immediately. CBS profiled her on 60 Minutes, and she's never looked back, touring the world and making home crowds in many places, including Mill Valley, California, where she performed many times with the late, great Robin Williams. Not content with facing the firing line of comedy audiences, a notoriously difficult bunch, last year Shazia signed up for the toughest challenge on television, Bear Grylls Celebrity Island, a show in which 10 celebrities are left for 4 weeks on a desert island near Panama. They had to survive against all odds by foraging for their own food and water and weathering devastating tropical storms. Shazia was one of only 6 to hold out to the end, 4 of whom were women. Shazia's last sellout show was The Kardashians Made Me Do It. Her new show, With Love from Saint-Tropez, is about censorship, feminism, and Donald Trump. Now, Shazia, what inspired you to go into comedy? Because weren't you a scientist?
Well, it was an accident, really, as loads of comedians would tell you, that it wasn't that what they'd planned to do. It was an accident, and I was teaching science in an East End comprehensive.
That's one of our high schools, public high school.
Yeah, and they hated me and I hated them. And we didn't get on, and they were really rowdy. Like, I'd come into the class in the morning and they'd go, "Oh, God, when is this going to end? God, you're so boring. When are you going to go home? When are you going to leave?" And then they'd throw a chair at me. And I realised when I started stand-up, I have never walked on stage and somebody gone, "Oh, when is this going to end? God, you're so boring." And then thrown a chair at me. And I thought, this is so much easier than teaching in the East End. I think I'll just carry on. And I'm getting paid more money, so I think I'll just carry on with this. And I did. I just carried on. I didn't really seriously think it was going to go anywhere. It was just something. I loved comedy and I loved writing, so I just thought I'd try it out. But I never thought ever that I would be a stand-up comedian. It was not something I'd planned at all.
And what was your family's reaction? Because presumably this isn't a typical career path for a young Muslim woman.
Well, they didn't know. I did it in secret. Stand-up comedy is one of those things you can do in secret, I did it. It's totally in secret for about 6 years. I didn't tell them because my parents are conservative and they are religious, and they live in Birmingham, where everybody, I know it sounds like a big place, and it is, but people do know each other. So I didn't tell anybody I was doing stand-up. And also, in the beginning, you don't want to tell people you're doing stand-up in case you're not funny. I mean, if people are not laughing and people don't think you're funny, you've just got to graft for a few years to get good. So the night before I was going to do this programme called Have I Got News for You, I decided to tell them.
One of our most popular panel shows here in the UK.
I decided to tell them.
Oh, that's probably wise.
I thought they might see me or somebody else might see me. So I told them, and they watched it, and they didn't actually realise what was going on. They thought it was a game show. So my dad said, "Oh, so did you win some money on the game show then?" And I just said, no, I was on there as a guest, And then people started stopping my parents in the street in Birmingham saying, "Oh, we saw your daughter on TV last night." And my dad would go, "Yes, that is right, that's right. But she has a degree in biochemistry, She is a science teacher, and this is just a hobby. It's going to go away soon." And so they were totally deluded then about what I was doing. And I remember telling some of my gay friends about it. And they said, "Oh, don't worry, the same thing happens to us when we go home. We all sit around the dinner table and nobody mentions we're gay. They talk about everything else apart from the fact I'm gay." And I thought, my God, that's just like me. Like, I go home, they talk about the Kardashians, they talk about Donald Trump. They will never mention comedy at all. They just don't mention what I do.
Your comedy isn't just about being a Muslim, though, is it? It's also about being a woman today. And, in many ways, you're a female trailblazer who has broken boundaries. Do you consider yourself to be a feminist?
Do you know what? I just wanted to be a comedian, and I just wanted to talk about myself and my life, which is what all comedians do. Every comedian talks about their life, how they see the world. And when I started comedy, I got labelled as Muslim female stand-up comedian from Birmingham. I had so many labels, and I just thought, I just want to be myself, and I just want to...
And is yourself a feminist?
I mean, when I was I never heard the word feminism when I was growing up. I only heard it in the last 10 years when I was looking for body wash. But that word was never part of my upbringing. We just never heard it. So I never labelled myself as anything. And I actually really envied all my white female stand-up comedian friends who never got labelled as anything. They just got labelled as, "Oh, she's a comedian." Sometimes they might get labelled as a female comedian. But I used to really envy them. I used to think, my God, you're so lucky. You can just be yourself and talk about your life. I have so many expectations on me, to represent my lot. I can tell you, my lot don't want me representing them. They're like, "Just shut up and get married. Please don't represent us." But I always feel like I come on stage, I have to represent all brown people or Muslims or women or British people. And it's really a lot of pressure when I just wanted to be a comedian and just be myself. But when you say, am I a feminist? I mean...
Well, because your new show does talk about feminism.
I talk about how confusing it is about what feminism is these days. When I was growing up, I never heard anything, and there was never any women that looked like me on TV for me to relate to. Like when Nelson Mandela or Trevor McDonald were on TV, my dad would go, hurry up, get downstairs, Nelson is on the TV," because Nelson Mandela was the closest thing to an Asian woman at the time. There was no Asian women on TV, so I couldn't relate myself to anything. And I just think it's different now because women have so many role models to relate themselves to.
Do you feel, I'm going to bring Vicky and Rebecca in now. I mean, obviously, as well on this, talking about feminism, what with Me Too, Time's Up, do you feel this is a landmark moment for women?
I think it most definitely is. I think it's been a long time that things hardly change. It's true, as we've just been hearing, that there are more role models that are indeed sort of Asian and Indian and so on, and Pakistani women reading the news and or doing actually quite important programs. There is a little bit more of that, and people can see that and possibly relate to it. But if you look at the progress that women have made over the last, let's say, 50 years, and certainly, when I started working, I was the only woman in the room usually when we're doing economics. But actually, it's still the case. I go to so many events, as I've just did today in a big manufacturing conference, and all the speakers, certainly all the keynote speakers, were men. And the majority of the people there were men, even though they made a huge effort to try and get more women. And there are very few role models in business, in politics. Yes, there are a few women we've had here, like Margaret Thatcher. I'm sure the American audience knows about her. She was our prime minister. And we have a woman prime minister right now. But in reality, women politicians are still in a minority. In business, if you look at senior executive positions, less than 10% are women still here in the UK right now. So if you look at girls growing up and the models that they can have on television or anywhere else, they're just not there in terms of encouraging them to do anything. But I think
and you're saying,
Shazia,
especially women of colour,
But
especially women
I
of colour where
I
you
still
don't.
think white women are doing incredibly well because at the moment, like Muslim women, the two role models we have, one got shot in the head by the Taliban and the other one's baking cakes. And that's the only two prominent role models that we have. And I still think white women, Angela Merkel, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, you have so many more than Muslim women have to look up to.
So much still to be done on this, clearly. And I'm so sorry to have to break up this fascinating discussion, but we are heading into the break. When we come back, I'll be chatting more with comedian Shazia Mirza.
Live from London, you're listening to MegaHertz London Calling with your host, Noreena Hertz, on Sirius XM Inside 121.
Welcome back to MegaHertz London Calling special show to celebrate Women's History Month. Now, you probably know who Bear Grylls is. He's the British explorer who got President Obama to eat a piece of salmon that a bear had already chewed. But you may not know that last year he gathered a group of 10 celebrities and transported them to a desert island off the coast of Panama, leaving them to survive on their own wits. The comedian Shazia Mirza was one. Shazia, is this right? You got basic tools and training, but then were basically dumped on a desert island without food, water and shelter.
That's right. I mean, the 3 days of training was useless. It didn't really teach you anything. And then Bear Grylls put us on his boat and he drove us around the Pearl Islands in Panama for about 3 hours. So we didn't know where we were and we were totally disorientated. And then he dropped us off in some mangroves where there were crocodiles. But we didn't know there were crocodiles. And just dropped us there. No mobile phone, no computer, nothing apart from the clothes we were wearing and a couple of machetes. And that was it.
Because I was a big fan of the show. I watched the whole show, and watching it, it just looked absolutely terrifying. Was it really that bad?
It was worse. It was worse than what you see on TV. It's 10 times worse. They make it palatable for TV because otherwise nobody would watch it and nobody would want to go on it. But it's actually 10 times worse. It was horrific. It was the worst experience of my life. But I knew it was going to be because I spoke to a few people that had done it before. I spoke to this one woman who's a doctor and I said, what's it like? Tell me the truth. And she said, it's absolutely horrific. It's the worst experience of your life. But if you get the chance to do it, you have to do it because it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. You will never get the chance to do that again in your life. And you really are in some situation, you're close to death. And when you're close to death, that really makes you aware of your own life.
One of the things I found fascinating watching it was the kind of different behaviours of the men and the women. I mean, when the show started and you all arrived, the men really tried to take charge. I remember they were peacocking around and you had some pretty tough men, didn't you? An Olympian, yes. You had the actor from Breaking Bad, yes. RJ. I mean, they were a tough group of guys, but they were hopeless, weren't they?
Well, they're very nice people, all of them. If I had to do it again, I would do it with exactly the same people. It's just something about machetes and jungles that make men go wild. They start running around like Rambo, Rocky and Godzilla. I don't know what it is. It's just some man thing. And when you're there, you really see that there is a difference between men and women. Men and women are different. Innately, there's something about men. When they got their hands on these machetes, they went wild.
But they never brought back any. They couldn't find water. They couldn't get any food. In fact, it took you leading a group to find the first water.
Well,
wasn't that right?
That's because they're men. That's it. That's the thing, you see. Men. These men went wild, running around the jungle for 20 hours trying to get water. No plan, no preparation, no development, no organisation, nothing. Just machetes in hand. Let's get water. Come back with nothing.
Rebecca, why are men so much crapper than women in these sorts of situations?
I haven't got the answer to that one. I think, but you must have seen so many different skills coming out and lack of skills in people in that situation.
When you're in a life and death situation, something in you kicks in and you do everything you can to survive. I know it's a TV show and people say, you're getting paid to do it. Actually, that's irrelevant because they do nothing to help you. They drop you and it is a real life situation. I mean, I was attacked by a stingray. I nearly drowned. We were lying in ditches. We were being bitten to death by sandflies and mosquitoes.
I mean, it truly looked horrific. You saw it, Rebecca. I don't know if you did, Vicky.
No, I haven't.
You didn't.
I'm just shocked. Why would you bother to do it?
Why would you do it? That's what
I mean.
my
You
mum
did.
said.
Wait, I have to ask you. You did say that it's one of the things that if you don't do it, you're never going to experience that sort of thing. But why should you?
I mean, that's what my mum said. She said, "We came from the jungle. Why are you going back there? You can't be doing it just for the money." I mean, she just didn't want us to go. Didn't want me to go. She thought it was so river. She couldn't watch it on TV. It was. The thing is, it's an experience that you will learn so much about yourself.
What did you like? How do you think you've changed as a result?
I don't know if you saw, well, there was 10 of us in the beginning, 5 men, 5 women. In the end, there was only 2 men and 4 women that survived. And what I realised is it's mind over matter. The mind drives everything. It's psychological over the physiological, because we had 2 Olympic athletes in there. One of them left. And it's not about the strength of the body, it's about the strength of the mind. And I think women have had to fight for everything in their life, or they've had to fight for a lot. We suffer a lot of pain physically. We've had to fight for our rights. We've had to fight for things in our life. So being on the island, it was just another day-to-day fight that we had to put up. I just had to feed everyone. I'm a good swimmer. The Olympic swimmer left. I just had to feed everyone. I had to just get on with it. And
keep the crocodiles at bay at the same time.
And that's it.
And she managed to keep the crocodiles at bay. Well, Shazia Mirza, thank you very much. Shazia's new show, With Love from Saint-Tropez, is travelling the world this year. To stay on top of what Shazia's up to and where you can see her, you can follow her on Twitter at Shazia Mirza 1. Going to prison must rank high on the list of anyone's nightmares. But for my third guest this evening, this became a reality. Vicky Pryce came to Britain from Greece as a teenager. To pay for her high school studies, she took a job in a London hotel taking room service orders. A scholarship to the world-famous London School of Economics, where Mick Jagger also studied, proved to be the start of a brilliant career in business and economics. Vicky is the first woman to have been made Chief Economic Advisor to Britain's equivalent of the Department of Commerce. She later headed the UK Government Economic Service. But in 2013, Vicky went to prison for having agreed to take her then-husband's speeding penalty as her own. Having experienced the justice system firsthand, Vicky wrote a powerful manifesto, Prisonomics, and is now one of the UK's most prominent campaigners when it comes to women prisoners and ex-offenders. It's a subject we don't discuss enough, which is why I really wanted you to come on my show, Vicky. Now, I've known you for many years. Before this happened, you were a very successful woman. You had a big career, beautiful home, 5 children. Prison must have been so far removed from anything you'd ever experienced before. What was the first night like?
It was a brilliant night, actually, because it had been so psychologically tiring going to court every day. And I had a second trial because the first one collapsed. That actually, finding myself where finally I got rid of all the photographers and all the reporters, and I was in a place where I could go to sleep and be peaceful, if you like. It was brilliant. They say that normally women turn their head against the wall and then spend the night crying. Well, I didn't do anything of the sort. I did turn my head against the wall and slept like a baby. But what was interesting is that getting there, I got so much help from the girls who were in prison, because they saw me, they knew all about me, they watched television. And instead of being nasty, as some people on the outside were forecasting was going to be the case, actually they run around trying to find me blankets. You're only supposed to have 1 blanket, but I managed to have 5. That within a few seconds, all these blankets arrived. It was very cold winter. And by the time the 6th one arrived, I sent it back. I said, look, I've got enough. Thank you very much. I don't need anything else. Was
that because you were a kind of celebrity going in, or do you think that's just because that's the solidarity female prisoners show each other?
There is a lot of solidarity. Everyone is being helped. I don't think I was treated particularly differently to anyone else who was going in practically the same time as me. But I think they had also felt, for some reason, a lot of empathy because they were watching all this on TV for quite some time before. And I got nothing but help from them, actually also by the prison, the guards, the prison officers who were there. And I did not feel that I was not treated with dignity or anything like that. So that does not mean it was easy. You get locked up. In fact, sometimes over the weekend you can be locked up 23 hours a day. And that can drive you mad. But I managed somehow to be out of my cell for most of the time in the 4 days I spent in a closed prison. After that, I was moved to an open prison, where it was very different. But what really did shock me, because I never expected, first of all, I never knew anyone who had been in prison. But the second thing is meeting all these women and finding precisely that help, that they were giving each other, because so many are depressed, so many try and commit suicide.
Can we talk a bit about that? Because I've been looking at the data, and in the United States, a third of women in jail have a serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder or depression, which is more than 2 times the rate of mental illness of jailed men. And it's a similar situation in the United Kingdom. Was there sufficient support in the prison for mental health issues for women?
Well, of course, they go in with all sorts of problems, including drug addictions, alcoholism, and, of course, very many of them have been abused by their partners. They are already depressed. So it is an extraordinary situation to watch them all. And, of course, they give they give ersatz drugs to keep them going, really, because obviously if you withdraw the drugs, you can have all sorts of weird reactions. So, but there isn't any real help, counsellors, or there's a little bit actually provided by the women themselves, who get trained to become Samaritans, and they intervene when someone is trying to kill themselves and so on. But so what you find is that although the prison population in the UK that is made up of women is only about 5% of the overall number, a third of all the attempts to harm yourself and all the incidents that we know are women. So it suggests that actually, indeed, the problem with women is hugely greater than it is with men.
And there must have been times when you felt down. How did you cope?
It's very lucky I'm an economist, I think, because I immediately started looking at this in terms of, does this make sense? Is there value for money here? What's the cost benefit of this? And even though I was joint head of the government economic service, and I knew the people who would have been responsible for doing the economics in the area of the prison service, Home Office, police, and so on. And I had assumed that they were doing the proper analysis. It was very obvious to me that there's something very funny here. Talking to the women and the reasons why they were there, you could see many of them were there for very sort of trivial reasons.
Yes, in the United Kingdom, 85% of female prisoners are imprisoned for non-violent offences.
Absolutely, and they're not a danger to anyone really except themselves. And because they have all these problems, it's an extraordinary statistic, actually, that you look at men and women, and something like 50% of the people who go to prison have no qualifications whatsoever. So there's also the issue of lack of education, lack of proper employment. And then, of course, women find themselves very often, as we've been hearing in terms of the cult before, either coerced or under the influence of their partners. So a lot of what they get arrested for, such as shoplifting or drugs, drug trafficking, or whatever it is that they're doing, is for their partner or for some man out there.
So do you think too many women are being jailed?
Hugely so. But I also think that too many men are jailed. The population in the UK has risen very significantly. It's doubled over the last 25 years, just at a time when, in fact, the crime rate from whatever it is that people used to do in those days, of course, now you have a lot of white-collar and cybercrime. But anyway, the crime rate has been going down, and not because you're putting people away, but because you've increased sentences, you've developed lots of new offences for some reason. But overall, crime rates have fallen. It was an attempt to improve the standing of the government in terms of law and order, but actually it's been devastating. Prisons are overflowing, and
it's a very similar situation in the United States,
absolutely.
Isn't it, as well? I'm sure you've looked at that. I think one of the things I'm also struck by is what a high percentage of women who go to prison are mothers. In the United States, 80% of women in prison are mothers. I mean, you've got 5 children. How painful was it to not have, and you're very close to your children, how painful was it to not have them around, and how much does it devastate a whole family? So it's not just the woman's life, but an entire family that gets devastated when women are sent to prison.
Well, my kids were adults or young adults, some of them still, and they were completely behind me. So if they were supportive, they would come and visit and all that sort of stuff. But you could see what was happening with a lot of women whose children were still at school or who were babies and they had to leave them behind. What would happen to them? What would their father do, or anyone else out there, like the social services? And it is an extraordinary statistic that if a man goes to prison, the chances are, in almost all cases, that the children of that man stay in their home. If a woman goes to prison, I think the figure is somewhere between 5 or 9%, between 5 and 9% of the children stay in their home. The rest move, either with grandparents or help elsewhere with other relatives, or they're taken into social care. And looking again at the economics, it costs hugely to put women and men in prison, more than it costs to send someone to the top school. But the cost for the children, and not just the cost that the children have to bear, but the cost of looking after the children and their problems, which of course continue because the psychological impact is quite significant, is huge, is much greater than just putting a woman away. So although of course there are not that many women who go to prison overall, the cost society of sending a woman to prison can actually be considerably higher than it is sending a man.
So how do you punish people then who do something wrong if we're saying that jail isn't the right option?
Well, look, first offences in lots of countries, you don't actually have a jail sentence. You can do other things such as community service. But actually, it's not a question of punishment. It is a question of looking after the issues that these people have. So there are women's centres that have developed here, and I suspect there are things like that in the US as well, which act as substitutes for prison. They're cheaper and they reduce reoffending rates, because obviously if you put anyone in prison, you want to punish them, fine. You put them in prison, they probably become more criminal than they were before.
Yes, because the reoffending rate's really high. It's about 60%.
Well, absolutely. And if you do something else like treat their problems, find them somewhere to stay, and make sure they stay near the community and near the children, and they get visited a lot by the children, so there's not this separation, which of course is terrible for the woman. I mean, the depression that I saw was extraordinary among the women who were separated from the kids. Then the reoffending rate drops very significantly. And as an economy, as a society, what you really want to do is reduce reoffending rates. And there is no doubt, I worked a lot with Cambridge University, the Institute of Criminology there, and when I wrote my book, Prisonomics. And it was very obvious that putting people in prison is not a deterrent for crime.
Should we be doing more, or what more should we be doing to support women once they come out of prison?
The most extraordinary thing is, of course, people come out of prison and they just have £46 and possibly a train fare for going back to Wales or wherever it is that they came from, assuming there is somewhere for them to go. Otherwise, nothing. And it has to be charities that intervene. Very often they end up homeless. And they have to get some skills as well to be re-employed and get back to society. Because if they're not independent, they can't look after the children and they'll fall into bad habits again. And of course, you have to deal with all their other issues, which are still there. It's not as if you've sorted out their mental problems. Actually, you probably have made them worse. But there is, of course, the odd occasion, and there are indeed a number of women who've been saved by going to prison. There's no doubt about that. And there are some dangerous.
It broke a cycle. It took them away from a pimp. They might have managed to get clean in prison. Okay.
And what is more, because they're so undereducated, there's quite a lot of teaching them to better reading and writing. I mean, it's extraordinary how many women I met who could not read. So you can do something, but what you need to do is concentrate on doing the stuff that you can do well and make sure you don't overpopulate the prison in such a way that you can't actually do anything for anyone of any good at all.
What was it like for you coming out of prison? How did you adapt? Had you already become institutionalised? You weren't in for long, but...
I wasn't institutionalised because I had gone very quickly to an open prison. I was only away for 2 months. And the way that I got it working in my head, we heard about the letters that you got, that
Rebecca got from the brethren.
Exactly. After you wrote your book, I was getting hundreds of letters every day. It was just an extraordinary thing. People writing with support and so on, which was of course very nice. I had that to do and respond to, but I decided that the way to do it was A, to think about economics, and B, also in terms of survival, which was very significant, is to consider it as being away for 2 months.
Thank you very much, Vicky. You can follow what Vicky is up to on Twitter at Real Vicky Pryce, and do check out her vast bibliography on Amazon or at your local bookstore. Well, this is all we've got time for today, sadly, and what a journey we've been on. From Rebecca turning brainwashing into a barnstorming life, to Shazia inventing a new genre of comedy and taking it to the world, to Vicky turning incarceration into inspiration, I feel filled with strength and optimism. So here's a salute to the valiant and the unvanquished, to rebels, nonconformists and the awkward squad, wherever you are. May your questions be unceasing, and may you always march to the beat of your own drum. Thanks again to all my guests here in London, Shazia Mirza, Professor Rebecca Stott and Vicky Pryce. And thank you, my listener, wherever it is you hail from, for joining us for this special all-female edition of MegaHertz, presented by me, Noreena Hertz. It went so fast. There was so much more we could have talked
I presume
about.
you're going to edit this a bit so I don't end up in half sentence at the end.
It'll be fine.
Or
yes.
mid-sentence
No,
at the end.
no, sorry. So he was like, we gotta stop. I haven't done my. But I did. I
Because
think.
you asked the question. Yeah.
Yes. How was it, Danny? You were our listener.
So interesting.
Was it? It was so interesting. We could have just gone on and on.
Yeah, that's great. Shall I take a quick photo?
Oh yes. Will you take a photo of us for the website and to publish and to share with you?
Come around this side.
Thank you. Come on. Oh, I just wanted that show to go on forever and on loads more and discuss everything.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
So
I'll buy the book and
much.
come and see your show.
Thank you.
We have to do a group outing. Yes. When are you performing in London?
Yeah,
soon?
I'm doing Soho Theatre. I think in April or May. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Maybe we'll do a group.
So we'll all come.
Group
I'm on all
outing.
week. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh, we'll definitely come.
Yeah.
All week, all week.
Do you like it?
Yeah, I like the venue. It's
They
really
have so
nice
much
venue.
good stuff on there.
Yeah,
and
they
unusual
really do.
stuff.
Yeah, risk-taking stuff.
Yeah, they have all kinds of stuff on there. Yeah.
So April or May?
Yeah, it's on the website now, yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well
So
done.
tickets are available already?
Yeah. I
Good.
think
Well,
so.
it was
Thank you.
fascinating. As I said, hopefully, I stopped in mid-sentence.
Horatio will
You
fix
do it
that.
all, don't you?
Tidy it up.
Tied it all up.
just Vicky's
Yeah.
last thing of this. So we can just fix on that. So it's going. It's like it's stop. Go. Go.
I'm afraid I hardly slept myself. Better reading and writing. I mean, it's extraordinary how
For you coming out.
that to do and respond to. But I decided that the way to do it was A, to think about economics, and B, also in terms of survival. In terms of survival, which was very significant, is to consider it as being away for
Thank
2
you
months.
very much, Vicky. You can follow what Vicky is up to.
Significant is to consider it in terms of survival, which was very significant, is to consider it as being away
Thank
for 2
you
months.
very much, Vicky. You can follow what.
Survival, which was very significant, is to consider it as being away for
Thank
2
you
months.
very much, Vicky. You can.
B, also in terms of survival, which was very significant, is to consider it as being away for
Thank
2
you
months.
very much, Vicky. You can follow what Vicky is up to on.
Also in terms of survival, which was very significant, is to consider it as being away for
Thank
2
you
months.
very much, Vicky. You can follow what Vicky is up to on Twitter at Real Vicky Pryce, and do check out her vast.
B, also in terms of
All-female edition of MegaHertz, presented by me, Noreena Hertz. For joining us for this special all-female edition of MegaHertz. Now, wherever it is you hail from, for joining us for this special all-female edition of MegaHertz. And thank you, my listener, wherever it is you hail from, for joining us for this special all-female edition of MegaHertz, presented by me, Noreena Hertz. And thank you, my listener, wherever it is. Vicky Pryce. And thank you, my listener, wherever it is you hail from, for joining us for this special all-female edition of MegaHertz, presented by me, Noreena Hertz.
And now we take you to London, England, where acclaimed British intellectual Noreena Hertz is standing by for her live radio broadcast. MegaHertz, London Calling. Opinions and conversations from a British point of view about Europe, America, and everything British.
This is not your father's BBC. No stiff upper lip, no keep calm and carry on, no tea and crumpets or tally-ho. It's opinions and fresh perspectives from politics to pop culture and everything in between. It's honest, fun, raw, and unfiltered. Live from London, this is MegaHertz London Calling with your host, Noreena Hertz.
This is Noreena Hertz welcoming you to a special edition of MegaHertz.
And now we take you to London, England, where acclaimed British intellectual Noreena Hertz is standing by for her live radio broadcast. MegaHertz, London Calling. Opinions and conversations from a British point of view about Europe, America, and every